On the easternmost tip of Long Island, where the land gives way to the vast indifferent expanse of the Atlantic, there is an empty space. It is a scar on the landscape of Montauk, a plot of coveted oceanfront property where dune grass now grows over the ghost of a foundation. For decades a house stood here, not as a monument to extravagance, but as a carefully constructed statement of quiet, unassailable power. It was an anchor for a man, and an empire built on an illusion as shifting as the sand beneath it. The structure itself was a study in calculated understatement. Clad in weathered cedar shingles, its 300 square feet were designed to blend into the coastal topography, to suggest a harmony with nature rather than a conquest of it. This was the architectural language of the established elite, a vernacular of Hampton's beach luxury that spoke of old money and stable fortunes. It was a house that did not shout its worth. It was designed to make you assume it without question. To walk its perimeter, even in memory, is to feel the persistent salt spray on the air and hear the rhythmic wash of the waves, a constant, soothing percussion that formed the soundtrack to a monumental crime. The house absorbed this atmosphere, its wooden frame breathing in the maritime air. It was more than a setting. It was a silent accomplice, a physical entity whose very existence lent credibility to a life that was entirely fictitious. Its defining feature, its soul, was a wall of floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the ocean. They were vast panes of glass, portals that erased the boundary between the curated interior and the untamable world outside. Through them, the Atlantic was a living mural, changing its mood with the light and the weather. These windows were the central motif of the house and of the man who built it. They represented a promise of transparency, an illusion of infinite horizons. This was the same promise Bernie Madoff offered his investors, a clear, unobstructed view to steady, endless returns. The light that flooded the open-plan living spaces seemed to suggest a similar clarity of purpose, an operation with nothing to hide. The house, through its very design, offered a guarantee of honesty, yet these same windows functioned as an impenetrable barrier. They sealed the inhabitants within a hermetically controlled environment, separating them from the raw, unpredictable reality of the ocean and the world beyond. From inside, one could observe the vastness without ever being touched by it. It was the perfect metaphor for a man trapped in his own lie, a spectator to a world he could never honestly join, insulated by a fortress of glass and deceit. The interior was a reflection of its owner's psyche. Every surface was immaculate, every object aligned with obsessive precision. The aesthetic was one of sober, minimalist design, neutral colors, clean lines, and an absence of clutter that created an atmosphere of serene control. This was not the ostentatious display of a man insecure in his wealth, but the meticulously ordered universe of a man terrified of losing control of the chaos he had unleashed. This space was the domain of a figure who projected an aura of paternal calm and absolute reliability. Bernie Madoff, the former chairman of the Nasdaq, was the embodiment of Wall Street legitimacy. The house was his weekend uniform, an extension of the quiet charisma and unshakable confidence that made him a financial oracle. It was designed to reinforce the narrative that he was a man of refined taste and stable, inherited wealth. But the mansion was not a home, it was a stage. It was not a trophy earned through legitimate success, it was a tool of seduction, a carefully crafted set piece for the longest-running performance on Wall Street. Its purpose was not to provide sanctuary for a family, but to disarm the powerful and the privileged, to welcome them into a world that felt so secure, so real, that their defenses would simply melt away. Its architecture was an instrument of psychological manipulation. The open design, the seamless integration with the landscape, the understated luxury, every element served to project an image of impregnable normality. Here, far from the frantic energy of Manhattan, in an environment blessed by nature and good taste, guests were invited to lower their guard. The most devastating financial transactions were never discussed here. They were simply allowed to germinate in the fertile soil of manufactured trust. The structure itself was complicit, its very beams and joints holding together a fiction. The illusion of openness concealed an abyss of secrecy. The warm, inviting light masked a deep, cold darkness. The house stood for years as the tangible evidence of a life of impeccable success, while in reality, it was the most elegant, most convincing piece of false evidence ever created. Today, the house is gone, demolished in an attempt to physically erase the stain from the landscape. But a structure so deeply entwined with a story of this magnitude does not simply vanish. It leaves behind a void, an absence that speaks as loudly as its presence once did. The foundations were torn from the earth, but the truths they were built upon remain buried, waiting. Luxury was just the surface. What happened inside, few dared to know. To understand the man who built this illusion and the world that believed in him, follow our journey into the heart of the great deception. The seeds of the Montauk house were not sown in wealth, but in the meticulously manicured lawns of Laurelton, Queens. It was a landscape of middle-class aspiration, a world of brick Tudors and quiet streets that existed in a different universe from the salt-sprayed enclaves of Long Island's eastern tip. This was the geography of Bernie Madoff's youth, a place defined by its proximity to Manhattan's power, but separated by an unbridgeable chasm of social class and history. His ambition was forged here, not from abject poverty, but from the acute awareness of a world just out of reach, a world whose codes he would spend a lifetime deciphering and then counterfeiting. His father's business, a sporting goods store, failed, leaving a quiet but indelible mark. It was not a cataclysmic trauma, but a lesson in the fragility of legitimate enterprise, a demonstration of how hard work and tangible products could evaporate into nothing. The lesson absorbed by the young Madoff was not about the virtue of effort, but the necessity of control. He saw the world not as a place of opportunity to be earned, but as a system of risks to be managed and ultimately eliminated. This planted the desire for a reality of his own making, one impervious to the unpredictable tides of the market. The first steps into Wall Street were not those of a predator, but of a pragmatist. With money saved from working as a lifeguard and installing sprinkler systems, he founded his own firm. It was a legitimate, innovative business, a market-making operation that used technology to challenge the old guard of the New York Stock Exchange. This early success was real, built on shrewdness and a genuine understanding of market mechanics. It earned him money, respect, and a foothold in the world he aspired to join. But it was the success of an outsider, a clever technician, not a member of the inner sanctum. The moral tipping point was not a single dramatic decision, but a slow erosion. It began with the quiet acceptance of funds from his father-in-law's accounting clients, a blurring of personal and professional lines that felt more like familial obligation than a breach of ethics. This was the first brick in the secret wing of his empire. There was no grand conspiracy at the outset, only a series of small expedient choices, each one making the next lie easier to tell, the next secret easier to keep. The foundation of the fraud was laid not with criminal intent, but with the quiet arrogance of a man who believed he could always fix it later. With each new investor came a deeper entanglement in the lie. The pressure to produce consistent, miraculous returns became the engine of the deception. The legitimate business, which was impressively profitable, was no longer enough. It provided wealth, but the burgeoning secret fund provided something far more addictive: adoration. He was no longer just a successful trader. He was becoming an oracle, a financial shaman to whom the wealthy and powerful came for sanctuary from the market's chaos. This role fulfilled a deep narcissistic need for validation that legitimate success alone could never satisfy. He began to study the men whose money he managed. He observed their habits, their language, and the physical environments they created to signify their status. He saw that their power was not just in their bank accounts, but in the effortlessness of their existence, the casual confidence that came from generations of accumulated capital. Their homes were not just shelters. They were statements of permanence, anchors of identity. He realized that to perfect his performance as one of them, he needed more than a tailored suit and a confident demeanor. He needed their stage. The idea of the Montauk house began to form not as a desire for luxury, but as a strategic necessity. The Hamptons, and Montauk in particular, was the summer court of the financial aristocracy, the very people he sought to convince. It was a landscape where business was conducted not in boardrooms, but over cocktails on a weathered deck, with the sound of the ocean as a closing argument. To be absent from this world was to remain an outsider, a service provider. To own a piece of it was to claim membership. The search for the property was methodical, a reflection of the man's obsessive need for control. He did not seek the largest or most ostentatious estate. That would have been the mistake of the nouveau riche, a signal of insecurity. Instead, he sought a location whose value was inherent and unimpeachable: oceanfront. The specific plot on the easternmost tip was a canvas of raw elemental power: sand, sea, and sky. It was a place that felt both timeless and untamable, the perfect backdrop against which to project an image of serene mastery. The purchase in 1982 was a critical investment in his own mythology. It was an expenditure of capital not for comfort, but for credibility. Every dollar spent on the land and the subsequent construction was a dollar invested in the architecture of trust. The house was conceived from the beginning as a tool, an extension of his persona. It would be designed to whisper, not to shout, to suggest a lineage and stability that he had in fact entirely invented for himself. The emotional trigger was this deep-seated insecurity, the persistent ghost of his origins in Queens. The house was to be the physical exorcism of that ghost. It was a fortress against the judgment of the establishment, a material argument that he belonged. By building in their style on their sacred ground, he was not just joining them. He was creating a version of their world so perfect, so aligned with their values, that it would be more real to them than their own homes. Its design was a direct response to this psychological need. The understated cedar shingles, the seamless integration with the dunes, the rejection of Baroque ornamentation, all were calculated choices. He was building a house that would disarm through its apparent modesty and good taste. It was an architectural performance of humility, designed to mask an ego of monumental proportions and a deception of historic scale. The structure was a manifestation of his pathological duality. The open, light-filled spaces and the vast windows facing the sea were for the audience. They projected transparency, honesty, and a man at peace with the world. But the true nature of the house was that of a vault, a hermetically sealed container for a catastrophic secret. Its serene atmosphere was the product of an iron-fisted control over every detail, a sterile orderliness that kept the chaos of the lie at bay. Before the first shovel broke ground, the house already existed in his mind as a fully realized concept. It was the endpoint of a long journey from the periphery to the center of power. It was the culmination of thousands of small deceptions, the tangible reward for a life spent mastering the art of the plausible. The physical construction was merely the execution of a psychological blueprint drawn up years before. The house was not a home. It was the most sophisticated piece of falsified evidence ever conceived. It was built to stand as proof of a legitimate fortune, its wooden frame and panes of glass working in silent conspiracy with their owner. The rhythmic sound of the waves washing against the shore was the perfect hypnotic soundtrack for lulling his victims into a state of absolute and ultimately ruinous trust. This desire, born in the quiet streets of Queens and nurtured in the immoral crucible of Wall Street, was about to be given form. The empty plot of land in Montauk was not just a construction site. It was the place where the myth of Bernie Madoff would be made tangible, where the greatest financial lie in history would find its sanctuary and its most potent symbol. The land was secured, the plans were drawn, and the performance was ready for its most important set piece. The structure that would rise from the dunes was not just an expression of ambition fulfilled. It was an act of colonization, an occupation of the very soul of the world he had so desperately sought to conquer. The construction of the Montauk House was, at its inception, an act of plausible deniability. It rose from the dunes in the early 1980s as a structure of calculated modesty. Its 3,000 square feet a testament to the success of a legitimate market-making firm. In those early years, the Ponzi scheme was a smaller, more manageable secret, a shadow operation running parallel to a thriving, innovative business. The house reflected this duality. It was primarily a family retreat, a place of genuine respite whose quiet luxury was easily justifiable by the visible success of Bernie Madoff investment securities. The architecture was a physical manifestation of the initial lie. It was built to be admired but not questioned, its value self-evident but its source assumed. The weathered cedar, the simple lines, the deference to the landscape, all were design choices that aligned with the established aesthetic of the Hamptons elite. This was not the home of a disruptor or a gambler. It was the home of a man who appeared to have mastered the system by respecting its codes. The house was the first and most convincing false statement printed not on paper, but rendered in wood and glass. As the 1980s gave way to the 1990s, the clandestine side of the business began to swell, demanding more capital, more victims, and a more sophisticated performance. The feeder funds, acting as tributaries, began to channel billions into the phantom strategy Madoff had concocted. This new influx of capital, stolen from a wider, more international circle, required a corresponding evolution of the stage. The house could no longer be just a private sanctuary. It had to become an instrument of expansion, a high-level networking hub disguised as a weekend getaway. The first major architectural change was subtle, yet profound. The original wooden deck, a simple platform for observing the ocean, was expanded into a sprawling, multi-level terrace that wrapped around the seaward face of the house. It was not a garish addition, but a seamless extension, designed to accommodate larger, yet still intimate gatherings. This new space was a theatre in the round, where Madoff could hold court without a podium, his back to the infinite expanse of the Atlantic, an oracle dispensing calm in a volatile world. This expanded deck became the primary vector of seduction. Here, over casual weekend lunches and sunset cocktails, the myth was cultivated. Madoff rarely solicited investments directly. Instead, he allowed the environment to do the work. The rhythmic sound of the waves, the salt in the air, the tangible evidence of his impeccable taste and success all combined to create an atmosphere of profound security. Guests, surrounded by such serenity, found their natural skepticism dissolving. The desire to be part of this world became indistinguishable from the desire to invest in his fund. With the fraud metastasizing, the house began to grow inward, adding layers of function that mirrored the increasing complexity of the lie. A new guest wing was added, a self-contained suite with its own private entrance and ocean view. This was a strategic investment in intimacy. It allowed key clients and feeder fund managers to be absorbed into the Madoff ecosystem for an entire weekend, transforming a business relationship into a performance of close friendship. The house was now equipped to not only attract capital, but to hold it captive through sustained psychological immersion. The interior spaces were reimagined to reflect a new echelon of wealth. The minimalist aesthetic remained, but the materials became richer, the finishes more refined. The original furnishings were replaced with sober designer pieces, each one selected to communicate a message of timeless quality and understated power. This was not the accumulation of objects, but the careful curation of an identity. Every chair, every lamp, every polished surface was an accomplice, reinforcing the narrative of a man whose fortune was as solid and dependable as the ground beneath his home. While the 17th floor of the Lipstick Building in Manhattan was a factory of fiction, humming with the production of falsified statements on an obsolete computer, the Montauk House was its opposite, a temple of perceived reality. The obsessive cleanliness and order within its walls were a psychological defense mechanism, an attempt to impose a serene, controllable order on the exterior world to counteract the spiraling chaos of the fraud. The house was a physical act of denial, its immaculate surfaces reflecting a world with no secrets, no disorder, no crime. Art began to appear on the walls, another layer of insulation against the truth. The collection was curated to project cultural depth, not just financial might. It featured works that were respected, but not provocative, chosen to signal a sophisticated, discerning eye. Each piece, purchased with the life savings of others, was hung as a silent testament to a life of legitimate achievement. The house was slowly transforming from a home into a private gallery, where the greatest exhibit was the owner himself. The expansion of the empire beyond American shores was mirrored in the family's own acquisitions: a penthouse in Manhattan, a villa on the French Riviera, a fleet of yachts named Bull. Yet, the Montauk property remained the symbolic anchor. It was the old country, the source of legitimacy, the architectural proof of concept. Its perceived stability and connection to the American establishment lent credibility to the more flamboyant international assets. It was the rock upon which a global empire of sand was built. As the fraud swelled to tens of billions, a subtle paranoia began to seep into the architecture. The open design, once a symbol of confidence, now served a different purpose. From his central position in the open-plan living area, Madoff could observe every approach, every entrance, every interaction. The vast windows that framed the ocean became a one-way mirror, allowing him to watch the world without being truly seen. A master puppeteer observing his stage from the safety of his control booth. The landscape surrounding the house was manicured with the same obsessive precision as the interior. The dune grass was managed, the pathways were raked, the native vegetation sculpted into a controlled, park-like setting. This was a battle against nature's unpredictability, an attempt to extend the iron fist of his control beyond the walls of the house and onto the very land itself. The property became a bubble of perfect order, a hermetic seal against the chaotic reality he was barely holding at bay. The addition of a state-of-the-art sound system, piped invisibly throughout the house and grounds, was another tool of atmospheric control. Music, often classical or soft jazz, provided a constant soothing soundtrack, masking uncomfortable silences and directing the emotional tenor of any gathering. It was another layer of artifice, a carefully calibrated sensory experience designed to lull visitors into a state of passive contentment, making critical thought feel like a discordant note. The house became a living, breathing entity, its rhythms dictated by the needs of the deception. During the week, it lay dormant, a silent stage awaiting its actors. On weekends, it came alive, a perfectly calibrated machine for the cultivation of trust. The staff, loyal and discreet, moved through its spaces like ghosts, maintaining the illusion of effortless perfection that was the cornerstone of Madoff's persona. Their silence was bought, their complicity essential. The pool, seamlessly integrated into the landscape, was more than a luxury. It was a baptismal font. To be invited for a swim was to be cleansed of doubt, to be welcomed into the inner circle. In the cool, clear water, under the summer sun, the hard edges of Wall Street dissolved. Business was never discussed here, but fortunes were decided, as guests floated in a state of suspended disbelief, their guards completely down. The wine cellar, though modest by billionaire standards, was stocked with vintages that spoke of knowledge and patience. Offering a guest a specific bottle was a carefully considered act, a gesture that implied a shared understanding of value, of things that appreciate over time. It was a metaphor for his investment strategy, rare, exclusive, and promising steady, reliable returns. The cellar was a vault of liquid trust. The master bedroom, with its panoramic view of the Atlantic, was the sanctum sanctorum, the one space where the performance could theoretically be dropped. Yet it was also the place where the weight of the secret must have been most acute. The endless horizon visible from the bed was a constant, crushing reminder of the infinite scale of the lie, a vista of the very real world he had defrauded. It was a cage with the most beautiful view in the world. By the mid-2000s, the house had reached its final, perfected form. It was a material biography of a crime, its every renovation and addition a chapter in the story of the rise. It was no longer a home, but a finely tuned instrument, each design element calibrated to disarm, to seduce, and to legitimize. It was the tangible proof of an impossible success, a quiet monument on the shore that radiated an aura of unshakable permanence. The structure stood as the ultimate paradox, an architecture of transparency built to conceal the darkest of secrets. Its open spaces held an invisible, crushing pressure. Its warm, inviting light cast the longest of shadows. At the zenith of his power, Bernard Madoff had perfected his stage, a house that had grown with his ego and his crime, a silent witness whose every beam was bought and paid for with the trust of thousands. Which detail best reveals the builder's vanity? The marble ballroom, the bulletproof windows, or the underground vault? The reign began in silence, not with a proclamation. By the turn of the millennium, the Montauk house had reached its apotheosis, a perfected instrument of deception. It was no longer a structure being built, but a system in operation. The weekend rituals were now encoded, as immutable as the tides. Fridays would see the arrival of the chosen, gliding down the long driveway in luxury sedans, their engines a soft purr against the whisper of the wind through the dune grass. They were not entering a home. They were being granted access to a state of grace, a world insulated from the anxieties of their own wealth. The performance of normalcy was absolute. Madoff, the master of this domain, would greet them not as a financial titan, but as a gracious host. His demeanor a study in practiced nonchalance. He offered drinks, pointed out the shifting light on the water, and spoke of trivialities, the fishing, the weather, the traffic from the city. This was the first layer of the anesthetic, a powerful dose of the ordinary administered in an extraordinary setting. The house itself, with its warm wood and clean lines, amplified this effect, its architecture a silent promise that everything here was solid, real and safe. Inside, the house functioned as a theater of transparency. The open-plan design eliminated corners, secrets and private conversations. Every interaction was visible, every gesture part of the public performance of contentment. Guests mingled in the vast living space, their forms silhouetted against the colossal windows, their voices a low murmur that blended with the sound of the surf. They were actors in a play they did not know they were in, their roles assigned, their lines, expressions of admiration and trust, written for them by the stagecraft of their surroundings. From his armchair positioned with geometric precision in the center of the great room, he held an unobstructed view of every entrance and exit. It was not the throne of a king, but the observation post of a warden. He watched the subtle currents of interaction, gauging the mood, identifying the moment a guest's guard was fully lowered. His control was not exerted through commands, but through the atmospheric pressure he had created. The house was his panopticon, a glass fortress from which he could survey his willing captives without ever revealing the nature of their confinement. Security here was not a matter of armed guards or surveillance cameras. Those were the crude tools of a lesser criminal. Madoff's security system was psychological, woven into the very fabric of the environment. It was the overwhelming sense of privilege felt by those invited, the social pressure to belong, the unspoken rule that to ask a difficult question would be a breach of etiquette, a vulgar intrusion into this temple of serenity. The house itself was the primary deterrent, its beauty and tranquility a silent warning against skepticism. The rituals of control extended to every detail. Meals were lavish but never ostentatious, served on the sprawling deck overlooking the ocean. The menus were simple, elegant, featuring fresh local seafood, a display of authentic connection to the place. This was culinary stagecraft, designed to reinforce the image of a man with simple, impeccable tastes, a man whose wealth was so old and secure it required no elaborate announcement. He was selling not just returns, but a lifestyle, and every perfectly grilled fish was part of the prospectus. The true business was conducted in the spaces between words. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the deck, conversations would drift toward the market. Madoff would deflect, feigning a desire to escape the world of finance for the weekend. This reluctance was his most powerful tool. It transformed him from a salesman into a gatekeeper, making access to his funds seem not like a transaction, but a rare privilege to be earned. The guests, bathed in the golden light, would lean in, their desire stoked by his apparent indifference. The house was a psychological bunker, its placid interior a shield against the chaotic truth of the global financial system he claimed to have mastered. Inside its walls, the market was not a volatile, unpredictable beast. It was a docile, manageable entity that answered only to him. The constant rhythmic sound of the waves breaking on the shore was the house's heartbeat, a metronome of stability that hypnotized his visitors into believing that such consistency was possible, even natural, in the world of money. Yet this bunker was also a prison. When the last car departed on Sunday evening, the silence that descended upon the house was absolute and crushing. The meticulously ordered space, once filled with the energy of seduction, became an echo chamber for a single monumental secret. The vast windows, which had framed a backdrop for social theater, now opened onto a dark, indifferent void. The ocean was no longer a symbol of serene power, but a reminder of the immense, untamable reality he was holding at bay. In this solitude, his obsession with order intensified. He would move through the silent rooms, adjusting a picture frame by a millimeter, aligning a stack of books, erasing any trace of the weekend's controlled disorder. These were not acts of housekeeping, but frantic rituals of psychological maintenance. Each straightened cushion was an attempt to impose his will on a universe that was, in reality, spinning violently out of his control. The house had to remain perfect, for if a single crack appeared in its facade, the entire edifice of his life might shatter. The art collection, once a symbol of cultural legitimacy, now felt like a gallery of silent accusers. Each painting, purchased with stolen funds, was a tangible piece of the lie. They hung on the walls as serene, beautiful objects, their placid surfaces belying the frantic desperation that had acquired them. They were meant to project a man of depth and taste, but in the lonely hours they reflected only the hollowness of the character he had constructed. The house was full of priceless objects, yet it was devoid of any authentic value. The grotesque nature of his isolation was most palpable in the master bedroom. Encased in glass, with a panoramic view of the Atlantic, it was a cage with an infinite view. Sleep offered no escape, as the sound of the ocean became a constant accusatory whisper. This was the command center of the lie, the place where the performer retired, but the warden remained on duty. Here the weight of thousands of betrayals, the faces of friends and families he had systematically ruined, must have populated the darkness beyond the glass. The fortress was designed to keep the world out, but its true function was to keep the man in. He was a prisoner of his own creation, bound to the endless performance it demanded. He could not leave the stage, for the character of Bernie Madoff did not exist without it. The house, the yachts, the penthouse, they were the load-bearing walls of his identity. Without them, he was nothing but the boy from Queens, the ghost he had spent a lifetime trying to exorcise. This reign was defined by a profound paradox. The more people he drew into his orbit, the more profoundly alone he became. The parties and weekend gatherings were not moments of connection, but of alienation. He was surrounded by admirers but known by no one. The empathy required to see his guests as anything other than capital sources, as human beings with lives and futures, had long since atrophied. It was a necessary amputation for a man whose survival depended on feeling nothing. Beneath the surface of the perfect host, a deep paranoia began to fester, a question that lingered a moment too long, a glance that seemed to probe rather than admire. These were perceived as existential threats. The open design of the house, once a tool for confident surveillance, now felt like a source of exposure. He was the most powerful man in any room, yet he was also the most vulnerable. Perpetually one slip of the tongue away from total annihilation. The staff moved through this tense environment with practiced invisibility. They were the silent stagehands, paid handsomely for their discretion. They saw the obsessive routines. They felt the crushing tension beneath the placid surface, but their loyalty was to the illusion. They polished the surfaces that reflected the lie, served the wine that lubricated the deception, and reset the stage each week for the next performance. Their complicity was a quiet, constant hum beneath the house's curated soundtrack. The house itself seemed to absorb the strain. The salt air that weathered its cedar shingles felt corrosive, a physical manifestation of the moral decay within. The sunlight that flooded the rooms seemed harsher, more interrogatory, casting sharp shadows in the immaculate spaces. The structure stood firm against the Atlantic winds, a monument of serene defiance, but it was being hollowed out from the inside, its integrity compromised by the weight of the secret it was built to protect. The children and grandchildren who filled the house on holidays were both props and potential threats. Their laughter echoed in the open spaces, lending the scene an air of wholesome family life, the final, most convincing layer of the disguise. Yet, their innocence was a liability. Their questions were unscripted, their observations unfiltered. They were the only people who might stumble upon the truth by accident, and their presence required the most vigilant, exhausting performance of all. His power was absolute, but it was the power of a black hole, immense, inescapable, and entirely negative. It drew everything in, money, trust, reputations, and crushed it into nothingness. The Montauk House was the event horizon, the beautiful, placid edge of the abyss. To cross its threshold was to enter a world where the normal laws of finance and ethics no longer applied, a realm governed by a single malevolent force. The theater was always open, the performance ceaseless. On a clear summer afternoon, with guests lounging by the pool, the illusion of invincibility was complete. The sky was vast, the ocean was calm, and the returns were steady. Here at the peak of his reign, Bernie Madoff was not a man but an institution, as solid and permanent as the coastline on which he had built his kingdom. The house stood as his silent, unshakable witness, but the ocean view from the great windows offered a different truth. Far out on the horizon, beyond the sight of his adoring guests, the weather was changing. The calm surface of the water was a temporary state, a fleeting moment of peace before the inevitable storm. He, the sole occupant of the watchtower, was the only one who knew that the barometer was falling, and that the foundations of his fortress were nothing more than sand. The first tremor did not originate in the house. It was a deep, subterranean shockwave that began miles away in the collapsing architecture of global finance. The year 2008 arrived not as a date on the calendar, but as a seismic event, a systemic failure that sent cracked spider-webbing through the bedrock of the world's economy. This was a force of nature Madoff could not control, a chaotic reality that respected no reputation and breached every fortress. For the first time, the storm was not a distant spectacle to be observed through glass, but a gale force that was beginning to rattle the window panes of the Montauk sanctuary itself. The change was atmospheric before it was tangible. The salt spray against the cedar shingles seemed to carry a new, corrosive anxiety. The Atlantic, once a symbol of infinite possibility and serene power, began to look like what it truly was, a cold, indifferent, and volatile mass. The house, designed to be a hermetic seal against the vulgarities of the market, discovered its own permeability. The anxieties of a terrified world began to seep through its walls, chilling the air within its meticulously ordered rooms. The illusion of Madoff's exceptionalism, the central pillar supporting his entire universe, began to buckle. He had built his legend on the promise of immunity from market volatility, offering a secret harbor where the wealthy could anchor their fortunes against any storm. But this was no ordinary storm. It was a deluge. The very concept of a safe investment was evaporating, and with it, the faith that had been the primary currency of his empire for decades. The sound of the house began to change. The curated soundtrack of soft music and the rhythmic wash of the waves was now punctuated by a new discordant note, the insistent, increasingly frantic ringing of telephones. It was an intrusion of the raw world, a violation of the sacred quiet. Each ring was a demand, a question, a tremor of doubt from an investor who had, until that moment, considered his capital to be as safe as if it were buried in a vault beneath the house itself. These were no longer the deferential calls of supplicants begging for entry into his exclusive fund. They were the panicked pleas of people watching their world dissolve, demanding an exit. The word redemption began to echo through the serene open-plan spaces, a term that now carried the weight of a final judgment. The requests, once a trickle, were becoming a flood, and the pressure was building against the dam of his deception. From the great room, the ocean began to look less like a backdrop and more like a mirror. Its churning grey surface reflected the chaos now consuming his investors. The vast windows, once portals to a vision of endless, placid returns, now framed a scene of raw, uncontrollable power. The house was losing its battle against the outside world. The view was no longer a curated masterpiece, but a live feed of the very forces that were about to tear his creation apart. The lifeblood of the scheme, the constant influx of new capital, had been severed. In a world gripped by financial panic, no new money was flowing in. The Ponzi scheme, a machine that required perpetual motion, began to grind to a halt. The quiet hum of the 17th floor of the Lipstick Building, where the fake statements were generated, now sounded like a death rattle. The house in Montauk, the symbol of the empire's peak, was about to become the monument to its fall. The physical decay began subtly, a metaphor for the deeper rot. A persistent leak appeared in the roof of the guest wing, a dark stain spreading slowly across the pristine white ceiling. The staff repaired it, but the mark remained, a small, stubborn imperfection in the otherwise flawless facade. It was a physical manifestation of a truth that could no longer be contained, a crack in the hermetic seal through which the ugly reality was beginning to drip. Inside the glass fortress, the warden's composure started to fracture. The mask of paternal calm, so carefully worn for decades, began to slip. His movements through the house became less measured, more agitated. The serene control gave way to a visible tension that tightened the atmosphere in every room. The man who was the source of all the house's tranquility was now its primary source of disquiet. His obsession with order became a frantic, desperate ritual. He would pace the rooms, straightening picture frames that were already perfectly level, aligning coasters with geometric precision, smoothing invisible wrinkles from cushions. These were the actions of a man trying to exert absolute control over the last few square feet of a universe that was violently spinning away from him. The house was no longer a stage for his performance, but a bunker where he waged a losing war against chaos. The silence that fell between phone calls was no longer peaceful. It was heavy, suffocating, filled with the unspoken weight of billions of dollars that did not exist. The vast, light-filled spaces, designed to feel open and honest, now felt like an echo chamber for his monumental lie. The absence of clutter, once a sign of serene minimalism, now just emphasized the hollowness at the center of it all. A faint, persistent smell of mildew began to emanate from a corner of the wine cellar, a place meant to symbolize patience and the steady appreciation of value. It was the scent of decay, of something precious turning sour in the darkness. It was a sensory assault on the carefully constructed myth, a reminder that even the most secure vaults are vulnerable to the slow, inexorable creep of rot. The tension began to poison the family dynamic. His sons, Mark and Andrew, who operated the legitimate and highly profitable market-making arm of the business on a separate floor, began to feel the tremors. They were insulated from the details of the fraud, but they were not immune to the atmosphere. They saw the strain on their father's face, heard the desperation in his voice during shielded phone calls, and felt the house's serene energy curdle into something fearful. The open-plan architecture, once his greatest tool of surveillance and control, now became his cage. There were no walls to hide behind, no office door to close. His growing panic was on public display to the very people he had deceived the most intimately, his own family. Their questioning glances were harder to deflect than those of any regulator, their presence a constant, silent interrogation. A story changed. A promise to a major investor to return capital was inexplicably delayed. A number cited in a casual conversation failed to align with a previous statement. These were small slips, hairline fractures in the narrative, but they were enough to seed the first real internal doubts. The lie was becoming too complex, too heavy for one man to carry without stumbling. The weekend gatherings, once the engine of seduction, ceased. The house fell silent, its purpose stripped away. It was no longer a theater of trust, but a mausoleum for a dying empire. The sprawling decks, built for hosting the powerful and the privileged, sat empty, exposed to the corrosive salt air. The place was haunted now, not by ghosts, but by the crushing presence of a secret that had finally become too large for its container. The final, fatal blow came as a number: $7 billion. This was the sum that panicked investors were collectively demanding to withdraw. It was a figure of pure fiction, an impossible demand on a bank account that was a mirage. The request was not a negotiation, it was a death sentence. The mathematical proof that the game was over. The house itself seemed to sense the end. The wind whistling through the frames of the great windows sounded less like a sea breeze and more like a lament. The structure, which had stood for decades as a testament to unshakable permanence, now felt fragile, a temporary shelter braced against an annihilating wave. Its foundations, buried in the shifting sands of the Atlantic coast, had never felt so unstable. He was trapped at the easternmost point of Long Island, on a geographic and metaphorical dead end. Before him, the vast, unforgiving ocean. Behind him, the wreckage of thousands of lives and the inescapable approach of justice. The house was no longer a launching point to infinite horizons, but the edge of a cliff. The performance was over. The audience was gone. The stage was bare. All that remained was the solitary actor, the architect of the illusion, standing in the center of his magnificent hollow creation. The serene order of the rooms was a mockery of the cataclysm about to be unleashed. A confession was brewing, a final desperate act that would bring the entire structure crashing down. The confession was not made within the cedar-shingled walls. It happened in the heart of the empire, in the sterile air of a Manhattan penthouse, a confession delivered under the pressure of an impossible number. But its shockwave traveled east, a silent tsunami racing across Long Island, destined to break upon the shores of Montauk. The house, dormant and waiting for a weekend that would never come, was the first asset to be spiritually foreclosed. Its identity as a sanctuary was revoked in an instant, its status shifting from a private residence to a public crime scene, a material component of Exhibit A in the case against its creator. The arrival was not subtle. It came not with the quiet purr of a luxury sedan, but with the percussive chop of helicopter blades cutting through the maritime air and the crunch of government vehicles on the gravel driveway. The house, designed to welcome the privileged, was now breached by the agents of consequence. The U.S. Marshals, instruments of a reality Madoff had long denied, did not knock. They entered, and with their entry, the hermetic seal was broken forever. The fortress of glass and psychological manipulation was now an occupied territory. The first violation was the sound. The curated silence, once broken only by the waves and soft jazz, was shattered by the crackle of radios, the heavy tread of tactical boots on polished hardwood floors, and the clipped professional language of a federal seizure. The house's carefully calibrated atmosphere of serenity was instantly contaminated. The air, once thick with the scent of salt and manufactured trust, now smelled of the cold, metallic purpose of the law. They moved through the open-plan space, not as guests, but as invaders, their eyes scanning for assets, not admiring the view. The great wall of windows, which had framed the Atlantic as a living mural of infinite promise, now reflected the grim, methodical work of dismantling a life. The ocean outside continued its rhythmic wash, an indifferent witness to the systematic deconstruction of the illusion it had once been forced to endorse. The view was no longer a symbol of power, but the backdrop to a public autopsy. The process was one of inversion. The house was being turned inside out, its private soul exposed to the harsh light of public scrutiny. Every object, once a carefully chosen prop in a performance of legitimate wealth, was now a piece of evidence. White-gloved hands, devoid of reverence, handled the designer furniture, the sober sculptures, the books aligned with obsessive precision. Each item was photographed, catalogued, and tagged with a number, a cold administrative process that stripped it of its history and reduced it to its liquidation value. The art came down from the walls. Paintings that had been curated to project cultural depth were unhooked, leaving pale, ghostly rectangles on the pristine surfaces. These were the first prisoners to be led away, their silent complicity in the fraud now over. They were no longer testaments to a discerning eye, but assets to be sold to compensate those who had been blinded by the very image they helped create. The walls, now bare, seemed to confess the hollowness they had always concealed. They searched for secrets not in ledgers but in the structure itself. The serene minimalism of the interior was now seen with suspicion, a potential disguise for hidden compartments. Agents tapped on walls, listening for the hollow sound that might indicate a hidden safe or a secret chamber. The architecture of transparency was being interrogated, its claims of openness treated as the most likely place to hide the darkest truths. The house was forced to give up ghosts its owner never knew it had. Floors were examined, rugs were pulled back, and the foundations of the house were scrutinized not for their structural integrity, but for their capacity to conceal. The search was a physical manifestation of the larger investigation, a desperate hunt for a tangible reality, for hard assets, within a world that had proven to be entirely fictitious. They were looking for the solid ground in a house built on sand, and finding only more layers of performance. The wine cellar, once a vault of liquid trust, was breached. Its collection, which had symbolized patience and appreciating value, was inventoried bottle by bottle. Each vintage, once used to lubricate a deal or seal a friendship, was now just another line item on a spreadsheet of seized goods. The faint smell of decay, once a subtle premonition, now seemed to hang over the entire collection, a metaphor for a promise that had soured in the darkness. The master bedroom, the glass-walled cage at the heart of the deception, was given no special deference. The bed was stripped, the closets emptied, the personal effects of a life of monumental deceit packed into sterile cardboard boxes. This intimate space, where the weight of the lie must have been at its most crushing, was now just another room in a forfeited property, its panoramic view of the ocean a final, bitter irony. The sprawling deck, the theatre of seduction where fortunes were charmed from the pockets of the elite, became a staging area for the seized property. It was a place of ghosts, haunted by the memory of clinking glasses, confident laughter, and the hypnotic sound of the surf that had closed so many unwritten deals. Now it was a place of silent, tagged objects awaiting their dispersal, the final act of a play that had ended in ruin. Outside, the manicured landscape was disturbed by the presence of authority. The dune grass, once sculpted into a vision of controlled nature, was trampled underfoot. The property, which had been an island of perfect order, was now connected to the messy, chaotic world it had been designed to repel. The illusion of separation from the consequences of reality was over. The house began to speak a new language. The clean lines no longer spoke of sophisticated minimalism, but of a sterile emptiness. The open spaces no longer felt inviting, but exposed and vulnerable. The neutral color palette, once calming, now looked like the pallor of death. The structure was being stripped of its narrative, its architectural voice silenced by the brute force of its own truth. The search found no hidden vault of gold, no secret room filled with cash. The greatest secret the house held was not hidden within its walls, but was the walls themselves. The entire structure was the vault, and what it had contained was not money, but a carefully protected illusion of legitimacy. The real treasure had been the trust it generated, and that had already vanished into thin air. As the agents worked, the house seemed to shrink, to lose its aura of power. It was no longer a monument to an untouchable financial genius, but the sad, empty stage of a failed magician. The light flooding through the great windows seemed colder now, more clinical, illuminating not a world of serene success, but the anatomy of a colossal failure. The soul of the house was extracted piece by piece. The furniture that had absorbed the conversations, the rugs that had muffled the footsteps of the complicit, the fixtures that had illuminated the performance, all were removed. What was left was a hollow shell, a void on the coastline, its vast windows now looking like empty eye sockets staring out at an indifferent sea. The structure was now just a carcass, picked clean by the scavengers of justice. Its value was no longer symbolic. It was purely material, a piece of real estate to be sold to the highest bidder. The quiet, unassailable power it once projected had evaporated completely, leaving behind only the ghost of a foundation and the lingering question of its true worth. The ruin was not in the cracked walls or shattered glass, for the house was left physically intact. The ruin was in its meaning. The architecture of trust had become a monument to betrayal. The house that was built to be the ultimate statement of permanence was now the ultimate symbol of a legacy built on nothing, a kingdom of sand finally reclaimed by the tide. So where does power truly reside? In concrete, or in what survives its fall? Join us as we explore what is left when the walls come down. Subscribe and reflect with us on the enduring ghosts of architecture. The house did not rot. It was not left to the slow, poetic decay of the elements, a gradual surrender to the salt and the wind. Its end was violent, mechanical, and deliberate. After its contents were scattered to the winds of a public auction, the structure itself was sold. Its fate handed over to a new owner who understood that the land was valuable, but the memory it held was a liability. The verdict was not neglect, but execution. A decision was made to perform a physical exorcism, to purge the stain from the landscape with the brute force of machinery. As if the moral contamination could be scraped away with the foundation. The demolition was a brief, brutal spectacle. The percussive roar of excavators and the groan of stressed timber replaced the whisper of the waves. A final, violent soundtrack for a story built on a deceptive quiet. The Great Wall of Windows, the house's soul and its most potent symbol, was the first to go. The glass that had framed a billion-dollar illusion, that had separated a hermetic lie from an indifferent reality, shattered into a million insignificant shards. It was a cascade of broken promises, a final noisy admission that the transparency had always been a fraud. What followed was a methodical dismemberment. The weathered cedar shingles were torn away. The beams that had held up the architecture of trust were splintered and hauled away as debris. In a matter of hours, the elegant structure that had taken years to perfect as a tool of seduction was reduced to a pile of rubble. It was an act of profound negation, an attempt to unwrite a chapter of history, to declare that what had stood here for decades had, in fact, never truly been. The house, a character born of ambition, was given a death devoid of dignity. When the dust settled, there was only the void. An open wound on the coastline, a scar of flattened sand where a monument to a lie had once stood. The silence that rushed in to fill the space was heavier, more absolute than any quiet the house had ever known in its loneliest hours. The ocean's rhythmic wash was now the only sound, a timeless percussion playing over an empty stage. The ghost of a foundation was all that remained, a faint outline visible only to those who knew what they were looking for. The architect of this void met his own end in a different kind of confinement. Bernie Madoff died in a federal prison hospital, his world having shrunk from an oceanfront panorama to the sterile dimensions of a cell. The infinite horizon he had once commanded through his glass wall was replaced by concrete and steel. His death was a quiet footnote, the biological end of a man whose social and financial existence had been terminated years before. He was erased not by demolition, but by the slow, grinding machinery of institutional time. The ruin he authored was not limited to concrete and capital. It spread like a contagion through his own bloodline. His eldest son, Mark, took his own life on the second anniversary of the arrest, unable to escape the shadow of his father's name. His younger son, Andrew, succumbed to cancer, a disease he publicly blamed on the stress of the betrayal. The house was gone, but the wreckage it symbolized continued to wash up on the shores of the living, a toxic legacy of grief and destruction. Today, the land on the easternmost tip of Long Island continues its slow recovery. Dune grass, persistent and indifferent, has begun to colonize the scar, its green shoots pushing up through the sand that once supported a fiction. A new, larger home has since risen on the plot, an architectural statement of a different era, belonging to a different story. Yet it sits on haunted ground, its new foundation laid over the ashes of an empire. The original structure is gone, but it has not vanished. It survives as a landmark of absence, a cautionary tale whispered among the Hamptons elite, a case study in textbooks. The void it left behind speaks more loudly than its presence ever did. It is a reminder that the most solid-seeming structures can be hollow at their core, that an architecture of power can become a tomb for the very legacy it was meant to cement. The ocean remains, the constant, silent witness. It watched the house rise, watched it hold court, and watched it fall. The great windows are gone, and so the view is now unobstructed, raw, and available to anyone who walks the shore. The barrier has been removed. The truth of the landscape, its beauty, its volatility, its utter indifference to human ambition, is no longer filtered through the lens of a curated performance. Perhaps the grandest structures are not monuments to our power, but fortresses against our deepest fears. They are built to project permanence in the face of an ephemeral existence, to create an illusion of control in a world that offers none. The Montauk House was the ultimate fortress against the ghost of a boy from Queens, a desperate, decades-long attempt to build a man who could never be touched, never be questioned, never be erased. On the easternmost tip of Long Island, where the land gives way to the vast, indifferent expanse of the Atlantic, there is a story buried beneath the sand. It is the story of a house that was a mirror, and of a man who built it to reflect a version of himself that never existed. The structure is gone, but the void endures, a permanent testament to the annihilating power of a single, perfectly constructed lie. If stories like this make you see power from a different angle, subscribe to follow other downfalls as astonishing as this one.